The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it, as by its course, in communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. President Thomas Jefferson.
Thus, in 1804, Jefferson sent off the group he called the Corps of Discovery. He had chosen the very capable Meriweather Lewis as the expedition's leader. Jefferson, being an enlightened man of his times, had interests much broader than simply commerce.
The President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, basically instructed Meriweather Lewis and his crew to learn anything and everything they possibly could about all aspects of science and naturalism out west.
And when time came for the preparation for the expedition, Jefferson sent Lewis off to Philadelphia to meet Benjamin Smith Barton, professor of botany and medicine and pharmacy at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the most prominent botanists of the times. Barton showed him how to collect plants and press plants and record information about plants.
And Meriweather Lewis learned enough in the 2 or 3 months before he left on the expedition to know what was different when he saw a plant, a flower, a tree, a grass out west that wasn't in the east. He knew enough to make that distinction. So he's not wasting his time describing species of flora that everybody already knew everything about. And he had a tremendous knack for description, intense description down to the tiniest detail. So he knew what to look for and he knew how to describe it.
And I think that is part of what mated him up with Jefferson earlier, as the kind of guy Jefferson wanted to head up this expedition.
He wasn't well versed in scientific terminology. He didn't name any of these flowers with a scientific name, although several of them have been named after him in the years since.
But this was significant in that this was the first scientific expedition in this country where systematic efforts were made to collect plants. You know, the scientific merits of it are great. They're unparalleled.
After spending a year struggling up the Missouri River to its headwaters, the expedition entered the land of the Shoshone Indians.
There's a passage in the journals where Drouillet, the hunter-interpreter, met some Shoshone Indians and actually commented on their having bags full of these roots that they were using for food.
Meriweather Lewis, Thursday, August 22nd, 1805. Drouillet now returned to the place they had left their baggage and brought it with him to my camp. It consisted of several dressed and undressed skins, a couple of bags wove with the fingers of the bark of the silk grass containing each about a bushel of dried service berries, some chokecherry cakes, and about a bushel of roots of the 3 different kinds dried and prepared for use. Another species was much mutilated, but appeared to be fibrous. The parts were brittle, hard, of the size of a small quill, cylindric, and as white as snow throughout, except some small parts of the hard black rind, which they had not separated in the preparation. This the Indians with me informed were always boiled for use. I made the experiment, found that they became perfectly soft by boiling, but had a very bitter taste, which was nauseous to my palate, and I transferred them to the Indians, who had eaten them heartily.
Lewis was not one to mince words regarding his impressions of the natural foods, saying this about his encounter with an edible mushroom.
The mosquitoes have been excessively troublesome to us since our arrival at this place. Cusat brought me several large morels, which I roasted and eat without salt, pepper, or grease. In this way I had for the first time the true taste of the morel, which is truly an insipid, tasteless food.
The expedition continued on, struggling over their first of several encounters with the rugged Bitterroot Range of the Rocky Mountains. As they dropped down into the Bitterroot Valley, they were hungry and exhausted. Their horses needed replacing, and the signs of the encroaching winter were everywhere. As happened so many times during their journey, they had the good fortune to run into the Native Americans. This time, it was the Bitterroot Salish.
When they looked at Lewis and Clark, one of the very first things they saw was an Indian girl, teenager, with the baby in the cradle board on her back. And they knew this was not a war party. And they knew it because no war party ever went out with the women along with it.
Common American myth is that we were discovered, and it's a perspective, it's an attitude. The Indians have been in the Northwest for thousands and thousands of years and have knowledge of the landscape far more in depth than those that came and discovered us or bumped into us. And some of these people, if it hadn't been for Indians, probably wouldn't have survived because they had Indian guides to show them where the trails were. They relied on the well-established trade system that existed for them to survive. You know, that's how they got their horses and their food when they ran out and they were starving.
Of course, it's a custom of Indian people. When you had visitors, you always put out food. And it's like Lewis and Clark when they came and they set out the Bitterroot for them, and how awful it tasted, how, and it was an honor for the people to give. If we had to set a table for the chief, okay, let's cook for the chief, Bitterroot would be the number one food there. Huckleberries, service berries, camas, the meats around it. And that was the number one food, was the Bitterroot.
Eventually reaching their goal of the Pacific Ocean, the expedition settled in for a dreary, wet winter. In the spring of 1806, they finally headed back home. As before, they endured great hardships crossing over the formidable Bitterroot Mountains. Finally, they arrived in what was one of their favorite campsites, a place they called Traveler's Rest, located at the junction of Lolo Creek and the Bitterroot River, south of the present town of Missoula.
I found several other uncommon plant specimens, of which I preserved.
So the Bitterroot, which is the rock rose, which is today named after Lewis, Lewisia rediviva, was first collected, probably noticed before, but collected because in bloom near the mouth of Lolo Creek in early July of 1806 on the return trip.
The Indians eat the root of this, near Clark's River, July 1st, 1806.
He preserved a lot of the plants by drying them and pressing them, so we have actual specimens of the flowers that he found.
Thus, the fragile, pressed, and dried bitterroots collected at Traveler's Rest were carried some 3,000 miles by horse, stagecoach, and boat, all the while being kept from contact with water. In early 1807, they arrived in Philadelphia.
Lewis was primed to bring back a collection that Benjamin Smith Barton would put into some sort of order and include in the publication of the journals.
That never happened, both because of Barton's ill health and then Lewis's untimely death in 1809. The collection, however, was a milestone in the annals of American botany.
Lewis brought back roughly 70 new species. He brought back a record of around a little under 200 species of plants. He brought back information that he got from the Indians about the uses of plants for food, for medicine, for covering. He gave us some of the first ecological information about the distribution of these plants that was ever known.
Friedrich Persch, a young German botanist and protege of Barton's, ended up with this extraordinary collection. It became his responsibility to complete Lewis's descriptions and eventually give the plants their scientific Latin names.
A small but highly interesting collection of dried plants was put into my hands in order to describe and figure those I thought new.
Persch went off to London, England to work on organizing Lewis's collection. Finally, in 1814, he published his definitive work.
Systematic arrangement and description of the plants of North America.
In it, he described 124 of the expedition's plants.
He probably gave Lewis the credit that Lewis might not have gotten from anybody else. He named 5 of the plants after Lewis and Clark, 2 with the generic names, Lewisia and Clarkia, and 3 with specific names to Lewis.
The bitterroot was one plant that had immediately caught Persch's eye. Aside from the fact the plant was a new species, the specimens exhibited properties that were most unusual. One that had been planted back in Philadelphia had actually begun to grow.
The specimen with roots taken out of the herbarium of M. Lewis Esquire was planted by Mr. McMahon of Philadelphia and vegetated for more than 1 year, but some accident happening to it, I had not the pleasure of seeing it in flower. Frederick Persh.
This behavior was altogether unexpected, given the fact that the plant had been pressed and dried a year earlier and was, for all practical purposes, lifeless.
And he ultimately named the plant the genus Lewisia and the species rediviva as it came back to life.
And thus, in a most logical way, the bitterroot came by its scientific Latin name, Lewisia rediviva. This ability to resurrect when seemingly dead was witnessed again, this time in 1862. The prominent botanist William Jackson Hooker, director of the Royal Gardens at Kew, England, received some dried specimens of the bitterroot. They had recently been collected in British Columbia, Canada, where they were commonly traded amongst the Indians. Hooker, in order to prevent the possibility of their regeneration, immersed them in boiling water and then stored them away. A year and a half later, much to his surprise, he noticed signs of life and so proceeded to plant them.
They produced beautiful flowers in great perfection.
From this flowering, Hooker created the world's first colored illustration of the plant in bloom.
We have at length the satisfaction of giving a figure from a living plant of Lewisia rediviva, of which hitherto little has been known. William Jackson Hooker.
He did take some artistic license, however, in showing the leaves plump and full, when in actuality, by the time of flowering, they would have long since withered away. He also passed on a story he heard.
The roots are admirably calculated for carrying on long journeys, 2 or 3 a day being sufficient for a man, even while undergoing great fatigue.
While undoubtedly an exaggeration, the plant's nutrient value has been well proven by the Native Americans.